forces. 60,000 Australians died fighting for the British Empire in the First World War, which was more than double the Australian deaths in the Second World War, I believe, just to give an idea of the scale. And we did that because we wanted a seat at the table in the empire. We wanted to elevate our position in the empire, to get more influence in the empire. And so we wanted to prove ourselves. So the logic was with the Australian political establishment by going hard for the empire and showing that you need us. When you actually go to war, you want the Australians there fighting on the battlefield, defending the empire. And we wanted to earn our position through that. And it did succeed to the extent that Billy Hughes, the nationalist prime minister at the time, was able to be a key figure at the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the war. And the Japanese, as an ally in the First World War, were angling for the introduction of a racial equality clause to be accepted by the League of Nations, whereby laws that were explicitly discriminatory on racial grounds be abolished. And Billy Hughes fought against that tooth and nail and succeeded partially by spreading fear-mongering propaganda around the legislation in the United States of America to create domestic pressure upon Woodrow Wilson at the time, the American president, to acquiesce. And so they did. It was also interesting that at the time we demanded Papua New Guinea from the Germans who had taken it. And interestingly, we actually had told the British before the Germans took New Guinea that they were about to, and that we wanted their support to defend it due to fears of having hostile powers on our doorstep. And the British told us not to worry about it, and ultimately that it wasn't their problem. We were right, the Germans took it. And another key factor into our participation, our extensive participation in the First World War, was the sense that if the Germans were to win, that perhaps Australia would be a bargaining chip to the British, that they would hand us over to the Germans in a wartime settlement, and we would start taking German immigrants. You know, considering how things have played out historically, maybe that wouldn't have been so bad. Maybe it would have been better if we had lost World War I and were handed over to the Germans. White Australia would probably still exist today had that happened in that alternative timeline. But you know, from the standpoint of that time, you can understand as proud Anglos why we didn't want that eventuality. But nevertheless, due to these foreign policy concerns, which were very real, we were all the way with the empire, obviously, up until the Second World War. Maybe the story of the Second World War would be better if I passed that one over to Grant.
Yeah, so, obviously, we go hard to defend England, to protect that way the British Navy isn't knocked out of the universe, so we're protected against Asia. Along comes World War II, and the Japanese are pouring down through Asia. They've taken China. They've used Australian steel to do it. Thank you, Bob Menzies. And then they started marching towards Singapore, which is a great trading outpost of the British Empire at the time. Now, the British absolutely botched the defence of Singapore. And we had thousands and thousands and thousands of Australian soldiers posted there under under British commanders. And basically what happened is they had all their guns pointing out to the sea, out into the harbour, expecting a Japanese naval assault. But they landed themselves over thousands of bicycles and little wagons through the land access to the back of Singapore and began a siege of the city. Some Australian divisions valiantly held them back for a couple of days, but suddenly the Japanese were knocking on the door, and the British generals actually thought that urban combat was not gentlemanly, and therefore immediately surrendered. And all of the British and Australian soldiers were force-marched to POW camps and died in enormous numbers. I mean, just on the march alone, thousands and thousands of men were killed. And then they spent the rest of the war in concentration camps where they were starved and tortured. And I'm sure everyone knows the story. But it was at that time, I think Australia really came to the reckoning that the British were out of the game. They pulled the plug on Asia, and we were on our own. So Bob Menzies tremendously lost the election. In comes John Curtin and the Labor Party, which mobilised the entire country, immediately putting everyone on food rations and portioning, nationalising industry, bringing online an Australian war machine to produce weapons and tanks and planes to defend Australia. Massive numbers of Australians were mobilised to fight, and we were already in the war with the Germans over in Europe, and Australia had a lot of soldiers, a lot of assets over in North Africa. And immediately John Curtin makes the command, we're coming back. And the British Parliament and Winston Churchill were sooking and whinging. You have to defend us, we're going to get crushed by the Krauts in Europe. And Curtin just said, no, we have to bring the soldiers back to Australia to defend from Japan. And this really is reflective of the psyche of the British at the time. These colonials, like they belong to us. They're our pawn on the chessboard. We need to protect the UK from the Krauts. Who cares what happens to this far off, backwards colony? But anyway, Curtin stood his ground. The Australian assets in Europe mobilized, got on a bunch of transport ships, and they were on the Pacific. And suddenly Winston Churchill gets on the foghorn to the captain and commands him to turn around and land all the troops in Ceylon to defend India from the Japanese invasion. Because Churchill and the British parliamentarians and the other financial interests in Britain were more concerned about their financial interests in India being lost to the Japanese than actually the defence of Australia and the white European descent people in Australia. Fortunately, through a couple of very powerfully worded cables from our Prime Minister, John Curtin, the commander of the ship did end up bringing Australia's troops and assets back to Australia to begin preparing for a defence in Papua New Guinea, which we'd freshly won from the Germans, thanks to the great foresight of Billy Hughes, that Papua New Guinea would be the buffer zone between us and the foreseen Japanese opponent. I mean, long before World War II, I read you that quote before about what would happen if England fell and Japan is our greatest adversary in the Pacific. Australian parliamentarians, generals, and all the rest of it had been anticipating this war, since around 1910, even earlier. So everyone was thinking about it, and the occupation of Papua New Guinea was an excellent play to see the defense of Australia from the Japanese. And so that, the war proceeds. I mean, the war has its own history, I suppose, but the impact, the policy implications to the White Australia policy is, by the time we've won World War II, it was with the help of the United States and not with the United Kingdom. I mean, not only did the UK, absolute scum, born to rule generals, surrendered our soldiers in Singapore and led to thousands of needless deaths, then refused to relinquish our soldiers from the European campaign. Not only did they do those things to a great grievance to our country, even after all the sacrifice we gave them in World War I, just absolutely no respect. After that, it was recognised that the UK could not be relied upon for our national defence, and that the United States was our new partner. But in addition to that, it really just created this great sense of anxiety. After the Japanese steel had separated many Australian heads from many shoulders, and many nurses were kidnapped and sold into sex slavery or shot, Australia became even more anxious of Asia than it ever had. But it began to manifest in a different way at the end of the war. It was now